Hi, everyone. My name is Liv Simpliciano, and I'm the Policy and Research Manager at FASHION REVOLUTION. And today I'm going to talk to you about why transparency is so important. So, in order to express why transparency is so important, I'm going to first take you back to a very pivotal moment that happened nearly 10 years ago today. On April 24th, 2013, in Bangladesh, a building collapsed called Rana Plaza, which hosted many different suppliers which were producing fashion for the world. On this day, workers noticed a crack in the building, but unfortunately, they were forced back inside, threatened by violence and firing, as well as withholding of wages. So the workers entered that building on that day, and unfortunately, 1,132 people died. And the reason why this is such a horrible accident is because the workers tried to signal that they felt unsafe entering the building, but they were forced to go inside because they didn't have enough rights to express their concerns. This moment is the biggest industrial disaster in history. And from this day, labor rights activists had to dig through the rubble to find the clothing labels of the brands that were producing there. And this was such a disaster in the sense that brands were not holding accountable or not taking responsibility for this disaster. However, it's important to say that whilst transparency alone couldn't have prevented this accident, we would have been able to hold the brands accountable for remediating the health and safety issues within the factories themselves. And it's important to say as well that from this moment, a landmark agreement was created, and this is called the Bangladesh Accord on Health and Safety, now known as the International Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which was signed just a few weeks after Rana Plaza, and is a landmark agreement that brought together brands, retailers, trade unions, and supplier factories in a comprehensive multi-year transparency and remediation program to address building and fire safety in garment factories in Bangladesh. It was the first time that global fashion brands acknowledge their direct responsibility for factory conditions in their supply chains. The International Accord is the first legally binding brand agreement on worker and health safety in the fashion industry. It was formed with the understanding that voluntary mechanisms alone are insufficient to address issues of health and safety because such voluntary agreements have not worked in the past due to this lack of transparency, enforceability, and assurance of meaningful representation of workers and trade unions. It is the most important agreement to date to keep workers safe. This moment in the fashion industry created the organization I work at Fashion Revolution. So Fashion Revolution was formed understanding that transparency is a critical first step in order to help keep workers safe and to address the issues, the systemic issues in the fashion industry. So Fashion Revolution was founded in 2014. And we are a global movement of people who make the fashion industry work. We're the people who wear the clothes and we're the people who make them. The movement has now grown to be the world's largest fashion activism movement, campaigning for a clean, safe, fair, transparent, and accountable industry. So we're made up of a group of designers, academics, writers, business leaders, policymakers, brands, retailers, marketers, producers, makers, workers, and fashion lovers. So we are a global movement that is campaigning for a clean, safe, fair, and transparent fashion industry. I'd like to talk about transparency and how we define this, because I think that's important for the rest of this presentation. So transparency, as we define it, is the public disclosure of information that enables people to hold decision makers to account. For the fashion industry, it means sharing information about supply chains, business practices, and the impacts of these practices on workers, communities, and the environment. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to show other definitions of transparency to help really broaden our understanding of what it means and why it matters. So this is a quote by Transparency in Action, which is an organization that campaigns as well for transparency in the fashion industry and is a close collaborator of ours as well. So to them, transparency propels companies to act upon environmental and human rights concerns. It is the proof of practice that can transform statements of intent into action by enabling those affected to check performance against policy and raise discrepancies for action. This is a quote by Industrial, which is a global trade union. And to them, they feel that transparency and traceability are critical first steps in accountability of global brands' due diligence and environmental social governance commitments. So from these three definitions, we can really see that transparency is an important enabling force for accountability and to address these issues that we have systemically in the industry. Transparency is that first step, kind of bridging the possibility of having that accountability and remediation of the world's largest brands and retailers who should be held responsible for the impact on the people and the planet. So, Fashion Revolution's vision is a global fashion industry that conserves and restores the environment and values people over growth and profit. And if we go to the next slide, I can kind of describe how we achieve this. So, Fashion Revolution works across three different pillars. We call these different pillars policy change, cultural change, and industry change. And in order to activate these different levers, we have different projects and activities. So, for example, when we talk about cultural change, we want to influence the hearts and minds of citizens in order to have a better relationship with the planet and fashion. So tools that we create to enable this are communication tools. We take really complex issues and make them more simple to understand and share to really foster that understanding of why it's important to understand who made our clothes, what's in our clothes, who made our fabric, and what the impact of the fashion industry is on people and planet. So with that cultural change, as I said, we create communication tools so that people know how to leverage their activism and use their political voice to campaign for a safe, clean, fair, transparent, and accountable industry. I'll speak a little bit more about the cultural change, but first I want to describe policy change and industry change. So in terms of industry change, Fashion Revolution publishes research that looks at 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers, and we review and rank them according to their level of public disclosure across various human rights and environmental indicators. And this is an important tool to press for change in terms of brands' sustainability strategies and their transparent disclosure of their actions that they're taking across their human rights and environmental issues in their supply chain. And this industry change that we're talking about, the research that we produce helps provide tools to citizens, tools to policymakers, but tools to the brands themselves to understand how they can be better businesses who respect the environment and the people who make our clothes. And in terms of policy change, Fashion Revolution advocates for change in the industry, advocates for greater regulation to make brands more accountable for their human rights, environmental practices. So we have close relationships with policymakers around the world, and we share with them our research to emphasize why it's important to regulate the fashion industry. Fashion Revolution has, for example, strengthened the UK Modern Slavery Act. We had close relationships with policymakers and outlined what actions could be taken to strengthen the UK Modern Slavery Act in order to make it more robust and impactful. So there's a few different ways that Fashion Revolution works both within and outside of the industry, but policy change, cultural change, and industry change are all three things that we work towards. This is kind of our theory of change. Again, I mentioned transparency before, but transparency in our view is the critical first step to lead to scrutiny, which means questioning what information brands publish about their human rights and environmental practices. And with that information leads to accountability and ultimately systemic changes, which is what we campaign for. So I mentioned cultural change before, and one communication tool that we launched in 2014 was the hashtag Who Made My Clothes. And this hashtag was created to help citizens understand who made our clothes, to understand the transparency and the social aspect behind who makes our clothes and all the different hands that our clothes pass through before they finally reach us in the store and we wear them. And this hashtag was actually the #1 trending hashtag on Twitter in 2014. So it really engaged people and brought them closer to the people who make our clothes. And this is, again, all in service of transparency, because if we understand who made our clothes, we'll understand that everyone in the world deserves everyone in the world does deserve the right to equal pay, the right to fair work, and so on. So this hashtag kind of lessened the distance between the people who wear the clothes and the people who make them. So this is one of the campaigns we use to engage people to help them understand why transparency is important. In terms of the research that we do, we really believe that transparency is the only antidote to greenwashing. And greenwashing is when brands may be misleading with their communications on their sustainability efforts, which could be used as a marketing tactic to gain more customers. And ultimately, it's untruthful way of communicating. So transparency, in our belief, is the only antidote to greenwashing because it enables scrutiny. And without transparency, claims made by brands cannot be scrutinized. And without that scrutiny, that's really where greenwashing thrives. So we believe that brands should be transparent on their claims by substantiating them with reliable and accurate data. And this cannot happen without transparency, which really leads me into our research that Fashion Revolution does. So, as I mentioned before, Fashion Revolution produces the Fashion Transparency Index. We've done this since 2017, and it's our flagship research project. So the Fashion Transparency Index analyzes and ranks 250 of the world's biggest fashion brands and retailers based on their public disclosure of human rights and environmental policies, practices, and impacts in their operations and in their supply chains. And the reason why we look at the world's largest brands and retailers is because they have an outsized responsibility to address their human rights and environmental impacts. And we believe that if we review these brands in an index, we can leverage their competitive tendencies and push them to disclose more information year on year. This research is very important because the findings of the research can be used by different stakeholders, like citizens themselves, who we encourage to feel empowered to use our research findings to ask brands critical questions like who made my clothes, what's in my clothes, and who made my fabric. We work with policymakers, as mentioned before, who use our research findings to form the basis of new calls for regulation in the industry. And importantly, the brands themselves use them because the index for them is like a to-do list on how to be more transparent and what does that look like in terms of best practice transparency. And if you go to the next slide, I'll take you through some of the findings. I think it's important to go through some of the findings because with the index, we really have an overview of the state of play and transparency in the fashion industry. And throughout, I'll share the findings and then explain why transparency on these different topics is important. So our first finding is that the overall average score of the 250 brands that we review across the index is 24%, which is very low for what we're campaigning for. 24% means that there's a lack of transparency on some of the most critical issues in the supply chain, like carbon emissions, traceability of where clothes are being produced at processing level and raw material level. There's a lack of transparency on water consumption and so on. So 24% really signals that the industry, which is comprised of really the biggest players that we look at, there's a huge lack of transparency and more progress needs to be made. And importantly, just to say, is that even if the overall average score was 100%, or if a brand scored 100%, that doesn't mean that we're calling them sustainable. It just means that they're disclosing all of the information required to hold them accountable should a human rights or environmental issue arise. If we go to the next slide, I'll just really give a quick overview of what the scores look like across the cohort of brands that we review. So as you can see, no brand scores above 80%. In fact, no brand scores 80%. The highest score last year was 78%. So even for the high scoring brands, there's still so much more transparency that could be made. And we're hoping that for the Fashion Transparency Index 2023, that brands have increased their overall average score. I'm going to focus on traceability and transparency of the suppliers that fashion brands use to make their clothes. So we find that more brands than ever, 48%, are disclosing their first tier suppliers. However, half still disclose nothing. So as I mentioned before, when Rana Plaza happened, there was such a lack of transparency in the industry, the activists had to physically dig through the rubble to find those clothing labels. So it's amazing that now, nearly 10 years later, we have 48% of 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers disclosing those lists. Hopefully an industrial accident like Rana Plaza doesn't happen again. But if it did, we at least have visibility of some of the world's largest brands and retailers in the industry. So should an accident like that happen, I would hope that we have enough information to hold the brands accountable for the impact of that. I appreciate that you might not be able to read the diagram on the right-hand side, but I just wanted to show you because overall, on average, in our traceability section, brands nearly half of the brands we review, so that's 125, score between 0 and 2% in this section. So you can see how much information is missing. All the way to the left, that long list, all of those brands score hardly anything in the traceability section. And even though 48% at least disclose their tier 1 supply chain, there's such a lack of visibility at processing and raw material level where the most issues usually thrive because of that lack of transparency. And on the left-hand side, I have a quote from Natalie Grillian, who is the executive director of the Open Apparel Registry, which is now actually called the Open Supply Hub. But I'll just read her quote here because it really hits home why transparency is important of supplier facilities. So she says, brands around the world are preparing for a host of new ESG reporting requirements, with organizations from across the sector in turn preparing to provide process and work with that data. The volume of information will be enormous. It is therefore absolutely critical that reporting is built on a reliable and collaborative foundation in order to bring about the supply chain improvements we desperately need. That foundation cannot exist if data is siloed or inconsistent. Open, standardized, and transparent supply chain data is essential. So Natalie works at Open Supply Hub, which is an accessible, collaborative supply chain mapping platform used and populated by stakeholders across the fashion industry and their supply chains. So as she mentioned, because of the host of new legislation coming to the industry that asks brands to mandatory disclosure of data, there's going to be an influx of data out there, but it's important that brands don't disclose for transparency's sake, but they're disclosing information in a consistent format that is standardized in order for it to be the most actionable as possible. So again, if looking at that long list of brands not disclosing any information, it only serves to make it more confusing and difficult to hold them accountable if a human rights or environmental issue happens. Again, this is just about Open Supply Hub, which I just mentioned, which is an open and accessible supply chain mapping platform. And on the right, we can see how many different steps there are across the supply chain, and you can imagine how much data there is to be had at each phase. And the Open Supply Hub is an amazing tool to help remediate those human rights and environmental issues. And if we go to the next slide, I'll have a case study to share on how the Open Supply Hub has helped create that. The Open Supply Hub worked with the World Wildlife Foundation. So the World Wildlife Foundation looked at the facility spread Open Supply Hub. So for World Wildlife Fund's water stewardship team, they had been looking to understand how the apparel industry is distributed around the world and how the global spread of facilities affects freshwater and biodiversity. One of the tools that they used was the Open Supply Hub. So for instance, when laying a map of the world's wetlands over the map of the apparel facilities in Open Supply Hub, the consistent overlap between wetlands and apparel production zones was immediately visible. This information not only helps World Wildlife Fund understand who they need to approach to advance their wetland conservation, but also sets the stage to identify areas of potential wetlands restoration that can benefit the apparel sector and even specific production facilities. This in turn is helping to build a stronger case for investment into nature-based solutions and mobilize financing for biodiversity. So as you can see on the map that I have in the middle of this screen, you can see the overlay of production clusters with vulnerable wetlands. And this information, again, is important to signal why conservation and investment in preservation of these nature reserves is important. So our research finds that 85% of brands do not disclose their annual production volumes. You might be wondering why that's significant. It's important that brands disclose their production volumes so we can hold them accountable for the issue of overconsumption and overproduction. You may have seen images of clothing piling up on beaches in places like Ghana and Kenya, or piling up in deserts like the Atacama Desert in Chile. So there's mounting evidence of overproduction in clothing waste. And if brands aren't disclosing the production volumes that they create every year, then we have an unclear picture of the problem of overproduction and if the solutions that we're developing are robust enough to actually address the problem. So some things that we call for at Fashion Revolution is to stop the production of new clothing, and this is called degrowth. And I think one of the most important things moving forward within a climate crisis is to reduce the amount of new clothing that we put into the market. And again, there's other organizations that are campaigning for this. And if we go to the next slide, I'll give an example. So Stop Waste Colonialism is an initiative by the OR Foundation, which is working to raise awareness about the problem of overproduction, particularly in the Cantonmento market in Ghana. So Stop Waste Colonialism is a campaign, as I mentioned. So waste colonialism would be helpful to define. So waste colonialism is when a group of people use waste and pollution to dominate another group of people in their homeland. So I mentioned waste in Ghana, in Kenya, and in Chile. So there's this practice of exporting used clothing, secondhand clothing, to lower income countries to sort the waste, but essentially the quality of clothing that's exported may not be good enough, and sometimes it's just genuinely trash. And it has a huge environmental impact on the people managing the waste, the communities buy the waste, and so forth. So Stop Waste Colonialism is a campaign to acknowledge extended producer responsibility. So this means the major brands and retailers will be held accountable for the full life cycle of the products that they produce and ultimately put into the system that may circulate for decades, hundreds of years, because they're made of clothing that is not biodegradable, that is, mostly plastic, aka polyester. So overproduction is a huge problem in the industry, and a critical first step to address that overproduction is brands' transparency on their production volumes. So our research shows that 29% of brands publish a decarbonization target covering their operations and supply chain. So this, despite the urgency of the climate crisis, means that brands are not disclosing enough information about what actions they're taking to actually decarbonize the supply chain. And even further, there's such a lack of visibility on brands' carbon emissions alone across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And you may be familiar with some stats, like the fashion industry is responsible for 8% of carbon emissions globally. 8% is quite a lot. But I think the reality is that there's such a lack of transparency on what brands are actually disclosing about their carbon emissions that the figure might be much higher. And again, it's important that brands disclose information about their carbon emissions because we need to understand if the actions that they're taking are enough to actually address the problem. So the fact that just 29%, that's less than a third, just published a decarbonization target covering their operations and supply chain is quite alarming. Again, I mentioned that we are in a climate crisis. We have reports coming out all the time that we've reached a code red point for humanity. So the fact that, again, less than a third of brands are transparent about the decarbonization targets that they have, and even less are transparent about their carbon emissions at scope 3, which is the most carbon intensive portion of the supply chain, is very concerning. Other organizations in the industry, such as Stand Earth, they publish reports looking at fashion scorecard in terms of using fossil fuels. And this report that I shared on the left, just to say, is that they find that 2/3 of the fashion industry is dependent on fossil fuel, and that 2/3 of the 43 companies that they assessed actually received a grade of F or D in terms of the actions that they're taking to decarbonize. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, we really need greater transparency on brands' carbon emissions and their actions that they're taking to decarbonize and foster that clean, safe, fair, and transparent and accountable fashion industry that we are campaigning for. So our research shows that only 11% of brands actually publish their wastewater test results, despite the fact that the textile industry is one of the leading contributors to water pollution. And I always think that this finding is quite shocking, considering that when we think about fashion and where fashion is produced, where the fibers are grown, like places in India and Pakistan, those are water scarce countries that are creating cotton for the fashion industry. And then when you think about the water that needed to produce those fibers, our research shows that just 4% of brands actually disclose the water consumption at raw material level where the fibers are grown. Hardly anyone in the fashion industry is disclosing the water that they consume to produce these fibers. And then when you have a lack of visibility on the wastewater test results and the toxic chemicals that might be emitted into global waterways, or the toxic textile effluent that might be getting into rivers that could be polluting communities that live near facilities producing fashion, it's very, very concerning. And I think if we go to the next slide, I have an example of why this is concerning. So this is Viola from the organization Greenpeace, who have a Detox My Fashion campaign, which is all about eliminating the use of toxic and hazardous chemicals in the production of clothing. And from her research and findings, she finds that 85% of the clothing market has not committed to the Detox My Fashion campaign. So that means the majority of the fashion industry is lacking commitments on reducing their usage of toxic and hazardous chemicals. And within the Fashion Transparency Index, we look to see if the brands are disclosing information on their restricted substances lists. So what chemicals shouldn't be present in an end product, as well as their manufacturing restricted substances list. So what toxic chemicals, hazardous chemicals are not allowed during the manufacturing process. If these chemicals are present in manufacturing and products, they can pollute the waterways at the production site, but further downstream at the post-consumer phase, when they are dumped in different sites, the clothes might be leaking or leaching chemicals into the surrounding environment. And as you can see, she's holding up some clothing, Kenya, where there are mounds and mounds of waste. And as they kind of sit there in the environment, they seep those microplastic particles and different chemicals into the soil and really create a very toxic and hazardous environment. And if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of switch to social issues. So our research shows that just 11% of brands publish a responsible purchasing code of conduct. So it's important to say that good purchasing practices are an enabling force for good working conditions in supplier facilities. So the fact that there's a lack of transparency on brands in the fashion industry to commit to good purchasing practices is quite disturbing and troubling. We find that brands are reluctant to share those purchasing practices and how they contribute to impacts on workers in their supply chain. So Stafis Udin is the managing director of Denim Expert Limited, which is a denim manufacturing facility in Bangladesh. So he says, if apparel retailers and brands do not practice transparent pricing and purchasing, an enabling environment for transparency across the supply chain cannot be created. In the global supply chain, transparency cannot be a standalone responsibility for the manufacturers and suppliers only. For ensuring transparency throughout the entire supply chain, a trusted and predictable relationship between the stakeholders is key. The garment industry cannot continue on a wing and a prayer like this. We surely need to have some say in our own destiny. Our survival cannot be in the lap of gods. This means getting a grip on the issue of purchasing practices once and for all. It means working together collaboratively as an industry to ensure we are singing from the same hymn sheet as regards pricing and contract negotiations. He further goes on to say that I think transparency is the future because it has the power to establish trust among people in the supply chain, which is essential for the existence of all of us on this planet. So you can really get a sense from his perspective why transparency is important to establish better practice in the environment, better practice for the people who make our clothes. You may remember or know that when the COVID-19 pandemic happened initially in 2020, scores of brands canceled their orders for clothing, orders placed and already in production. And that was really harmful because brands broke a contract with the suppliers who front the costs of production. So as an example, when the brands canceled those orders, the suppliers had put forth so much money to make the clothes, and now they had all this unsold stock in their warehouses and their facilities. The suppliers couldn't pay workers their wages, and it created a domino effect of massive wage theft in the billions. But organizations like Clean Clothes Campaign and Remake and so forth have a campaign called Pay Up, and they have actually been able to hold brands accountable for this wage theft. So again, transparency is so key, because without transparency of where the brands were producing their clothes, you couldn't establish the links between the brand and that wage theft. So many brands have been held accountable for this wage theft and have paid suppliers and workers the wages that they were due. And finally, the last finding that we have is that 96% of brands do not publish the number of workers in their supply chain paid a living wage rate. So the majority of the fashion industry, or at least the 250 brands that we review, do not disclose if workers are paid a living wage. So a lack of commitment to transparency on living wages really persists. And this lack of information means that across the indicators that we review, we also don't know if the labor costs are a fixed line item in price negotiations. Labor should always be a fixed line item and not something that gets pushed further and further down through brand and supplier negotiations. And garment workers, they don't earn enough money to have savings, to send their kids to school, to put nutritious food on the table, and to save for crises that may be impending. So when we think about the climate crisis and forced economic migration, garment workers are not, they don't have savings resilient enough to help protect them should a disaster or, climate related migration force them to leave their homes. So it's really important that garment workers are paid that living wage rate. In fact, it could be a climate solution, because if we pay workers a living wage rate, we can slow down the fashion system. And it's important to say, I mentioned before, that our research findings can form the basis for new regulation in the industry. So that lack of transparency on living wages led us to draft a legal proposal for our campaign called Good Clothes, Fair Pay, which is using a form of participatory democracy called a European Citizens Initiative. So we've drafted a legal proposal demanding mandatory living wages due diligence across fashion supply chains. This legal proposal also proposes that unfair purchasing practices, like canceling orders, like changing the price of the orders and so on, as unfair and illegal. So this is a landmark legal proposal, landmark campaign, and we need 1 million signatures by July 2023 in order to discuss our legal proposal in European Parliament. However, we have very close relationships with members of European Parliament who are very much in support of this legal proposal. And this legal proposal would apply to all brands selling within the EU market. So it has the power to really transform global supply chains. And that transparency could help lift millions of garment workers, most of whom are women, out of poverty. So it's a really groundbreaking campaign. And again, that lack of transparency that we found on living wages helped inform calls for greater regulation in the industry. Transparency is a very critical component. It's the first step. Can't stress this enough. It's the first step in order to achieve a clean, safe, fair, and accountable fashion industry. In my view, transparency is literally the bare minimum that we can expect from major brands and retailers. They should be honest about their impacts on people and the planet. They should be transparent about their policies, practices, outcomes, and impacts. And yet, only 24% is the average score overall of the world's largest brands and retailers. And in fact, 20 companies produce 98% of the profits made from fashion. So you can understand how unfair and powerful this dynamic is. So it's really important and critical that brands are transparent about these practices. And again, it's not just transparency for transparency's sake. They need to be disclosing information that's actionable for affected stakeholders like worker rights groups, workers themselves, environmental activists, and so on. And again, in order to create actionable data, the data disclosed in the supply chain needs to be open, standardized, and so on, in order to drive those improvements that we desperately need. And that is also the view of Open Supply Hub, which I mentioned before, but this is another quote by the executive director, Natalie. This is a quote by Nazreen Sheikh, who's a former child garment worker who now leads Empowerment Collective, where she empowers Are there garment workers experiencing exploitation? So, in her quote, she says that today, still 160 million children are in child labor all around the world. If everyone can bring transparency around their supply chain, we can end this problem. And I bring this up again because our research finds that 86% of brands disclose a policy against child labor in the supply chains, and yet not paying living wages is one of the main causes of child and forced labor. So, all of this to say is that whilst we have transparency on these policies against child labor, the fact that 96% of brands do not disclose the number of workers in their supply chain paid a living wage rate, this discrepancy between these two figures again shows that there's a lack of connection or acknowledgement that child labor is an outcome of not paying their parents living wages. So it's really important that we have transparency across an array of human rights and environmental issues so that we can hold the biggest players in the industry to account. And finally, how do we take action on transparency? What happens next? So we believe that anyone anywhere should be able to find out how, where, and by whom, and at what social and environmental costs their clothes are made. So, as citizens like you and I, that means calling on major brands and retailers to be more transparent, policymakers to create legislation that holds brands accountable, such as our Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign, which I mentioned. For the major brands and retailers themselves, they must publish their supply chain down to raw material level as soon as possible and align with open data standard. They have to be completely transparent on all the topics covered in the Fashion Transparency Index and to continuously update that public disclosure in response to evolving risks. It means implementing robust due diligence on human rights and environmental risks and publicly evidence the outcomes and impacts of their efforts. For policymakers, it means supporting better regulations, laws, and government policies that should require transparency and corporate accountability on environmental and human rights issues. And for investors and shareholders who may be investing into fashion brands, they need to prioritize meaningful and credible environmental, social, and governance factors into their investment strategies. And finally, for broader civil society, including journalists and academics, it means to use transparency, to use data and findings to verify the public claims made by brands and to hold them accountable, and to raise the flag when brands make claims that do not reflect the reality on the ground. So there's a lot of different actions that can be taken toward a more transparent, fair, and accountable industry across what citizens can do, brands and retailers, policymakers, investors, and civil society at large can do to establish a fairer fashion industry for all. And I think if I have one message, I think I'd like to bring it back to, I guess, the perception in the fashion industry is that transparency is lacking in the Asian market. And I think there might be this cultural tendency to wait to be perfect before you're open and honest about your supply chain practices and the impacts of those practices on the communities in which our clothes are being made. But I think not being transparent and waiting for that perfection or perceived perfection actually impedes progress. I always say that transparency is a capacity building exercise because when you're open, transparent, and honest about your practices, civil society, affected stakeholders, and so on can actually hold you accountable for the impacts of your business. And that accountability piece and that scrutiny piece is so important because it can help you push higher, it can help you punch higher and have better policies. And it's a learning experience. You might not always get it right. And I'm very aware that not getting it right might have very serious legal or financial implications. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we have one planet, we have so much to work against when we think about the climate crisis and the impacts that the fashion industry systemically perpetuates since the beginning. The fact that the fashion industry is only going to grow in the coming years, which means greater impact on people and planet. So that transparency piece is just so critical. And I think in order to build a fairer fashion industry and so forth, we need brands to be transparent about their practices and not wait to be perfect to be transparent, because you need to hold stakeholders and shareholders with you. And I think we need to look at financial systems like the first shareholders are often the investors, but we really need to think, who are the critical shareholders actually? And it's the people who make our clothes. And the wealth of this industry is built on the hard work of garment workers. And I think it's important to name that a CEO, a fashion CEO, earns what a garment worker would earn her whole lifetime in just 4 days. So we really owe it to garment workers, we owe it to the people who make our clothes, the communities around where we make our clothes. We need to really honor them. And I just think, in service of creating that better fashion industry, transparency is that critical first step. And it's truly the bare minimum we can expect from brands. So don't be scared to be transparent. It's a journey, and it's never ending. So it's important that you are honest as you can be at the start. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you can take action and be curious, find out, and do something, and help us achieve a fairer fashion industry. Thank you.